ANA eLearning Academy is brought to you by CDN Graysheet, a trusted source of rare coin and currency valuations since 1963.
Thank you everyone for joining us today for the ANA eLearning Academy. The ANA would like to thank our partner Graysheet for their support of the eLearning Academy. Today we have Larry, who is going to be presenting on the Shippingport Ferry token. You will be muted for this, so if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will read them to Larry at the end. And without further ado, here's Larry.
Hey, hello. Thanks everyone who's here joining in. Thanks for joining in this talk as part of National Coin Week. It's a pretty big week for a lot of people. This is about the Shippingport Ferry token. I want to make a point here that this is Shippingport, Pennsylvania, not Shippingport, Kentucky. Shippingport Ferry token. Now, this is essentially an expansion of an article that I wrote in the Tams Journal back in August of 1991 when I first got interested in the Shippingport Ferry through acquiring the token at a local coin dealer, and then discovered that some of the people were still alive. And so I did some research through the Beaver County Historical Society and the newspapers, and had the very good opportunity to interview one of the former owners and the sister of the other deceased former owner. So that's where this information is. Within view of the world's first nuclear power plant, and I have a slide here showing a marker. The marker, which is down here, you can't read, so I got a picture of it and put it there. Within view of the world's first peacetime nuclear power plant, the two tiny ferry boats named the Chrismor and the Nancy operated on the Ohio River. This is the Ohio River above the city of Pittsburgh as it makes its shot down south and west towards the Mississippi. This ferry linked the towns of Shippingport and Midland in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and they had no set schedule. The winter was called slow time, and they ran between 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And during fast time, the other times of the year, they extended their hours to about 8 o'clock in the evening. And all you had to do was wave, honk your horn, or board the ferry. And once aboard, you paid with a cash or a token. And it took you about 10 minutes to cross the 1,200-foot width of the Ohio River at that time. Now, I said Shippingport, Pennsylvania. I put this map together. Hope it gives you an idea, and there's a reason for it. As you could see, city of Pittsburgh in Allegheny County, you go up the Ohio River, and it intersects with the Beaver River here in Beaver, Pennsylvania, and naturally Beaver County. And the river shoots back down south and west as it shoots south. And the reason I do this is Shippingport and Midland are very close to the state of Ohio and West Virginia. And this would be the top of the West Virginia Panhandle. And that's where this place is located. Wanting to make it look, this is what it looks like today. And this is an aerial shot. Shippingport is outlined here in this pink outline. That's the municipality of Shippingport. And you wonder, what's all the stuff here? Well, the town of Shippingport is right here in the middle, if you can see it. On this side is a nuclear power plant that was put into operation in the late 50s. Eisenhower flipped a switch from the White House to start the first peacetime nuclear power plant. And this is another large power plant, the coal-fired plant, the Bruce Mansfield plant. If you're not familiar, many people come to see Shippingport. They will come drive by. This is a bigger plant, 3 stacks. It looks really more impressive. And the nuclear plant is over here with 2 cooling towers, and there are multiple cooling towers on the other side. But this is Shippingport. This is the city of the town of Midland. This large area, and this is pretty typical of Western Pennsylvania because we were essentially industrial. This used to be the old J&L mill. Then it was Crucible Steel. At the time the Shippingport Ferry went out of business, it was Crucible, and now it's Allegheny Technologies International, which was a former Allegheny Ludlam. The steel mills and stuff are along the river because of access to the water, and the towns are associated with it. So this is where it is, and this is where the bridge and the nuclear power plant is right now. So when the land in Beaver County was settled in the 1790s, people who lived along the river owned skiffs and john boats, very much like this. This is the Ohio River near Shippingport around 1915. And these are the type of boats that operated on that river, not just at the turn of the 20th century, but well into the mid and starting into the upper 20th century. They did those and they crossed the Ohio. And this was still a practice as late as 1960. Students attending Midland High School lived across the river in Shippingport, and they'd save the cost of a fare by rowing their boats home in the evenings after school. And of course, they had to do that, especially if they played football or basketball, because then they would be done after 6 o'clock in the wintertime, and they would have to row home because the ferry would not be operational. The ferry route is right here. This is Shippingport with all the stuff with the mills and that. The town of Shippingport, and the ferry was about 300, maybe 400 yards up from where the bridge is and the Beaver Valley power station is. And Midland was there. Before 1963, Pennsylvania had 1,500 school districts, and each of these school districts had their own schools. They consolidated in the early 60s. And so after the early 60s, then there was another school district on this side of the river, so students who lived in Shippingport didn't have to take the ferry over to go to school. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers reported it in the early days of the ferry. The river ran about 1 foot deep during the summer between Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, and the winter would impede the ferry crossings, of course, but created the situation where they could walk across. So there wasn't really much of a problem there. The ferry operated during the warm months, not the cold months. Prior to the 30s, the river ran at least about 14 feet lower than it does today, and there was a construction of the Montgomery Dam. Let me see if I can go back. The Montgomery Dam would be up here just before this turn, okay? And then the whole series of dams that were put together in the 30s really made the change of the river. Cook's Ferry incorporated, it actually began in 1858. Okay, this is a picture of Cook's Ferry in the early 1890s. George Washington Cook started it, and he started as a ferry passenger, all just for people to go across the river. The next year, he expanded it to include horses and buggies. This is Cook's Ferry at the turn of the 20th century. He relied on the river, of course. It went back and forth, and they tried to do it, and it was hooked up by a cable. And then they pulled it through a cable, and then they added steam power. Later on, they put a Ford V8 on the back of that, and then finally, they put in diesel tugboats, and that's where the tugboats come in, and you'll see a little bit later. This was incorporated in 1892, and the Fleming family purchased it in 1918 and ran it for about a year, and they sold it to a guy named Morrow, Al Morrow. In 1956, Jack Morrow, Al's son, got together with a guy named Bob Christy, and they put the thing together in 1956. Here's a picture of the two of them with the Chrismor down at the bottom. They bought a tugboat. They named it a Chrismor, Chris and Morrow, after the two of them, and it was attached by a bull rope alongside a 50-foot steel flatboat called the Manchester. Now, the Manchester was fitted with metal railings along the side. That's just the way it was. There you could take a look. There's the Chrismor, and those are the boats on it. This is, I guess, the late 1950s, early 1960s. It says 58 Edsel there for all of you old folk like me. So the deck was wide enough, of course, for 2 lanes of vehicles, and they had hinge runways at each end because then it dropped them down, and that's how the cars got up onto it. The deck was there, and they hoisted them up, and they drove on simply. And the second one came by, and that was the Nancy. The Nancy was a smaller tugboat attached to a smaller barge, and that barge was called the Sarah M. They gave names to all of them. The Chrismor operated continually throughout the day. It was the main one. So If you needed to go across the river, that's essentially how you did it. The Nancy would alternate the trips across during the really business times, and that would be the mornings and the evenings, and accommodated the workers. If you remember, you saw the mill on the other side that was J&L back then in Crucible, and on the one side you had the nuclear power plant. And so at the shifts when they were changing, it was very, very busy. So they needed the boats in tandem. Here's a picture of the Chrismor and the Nancy in tandem as they're loading up during one of the busy times. Morrow explained that the two boats that operated in tandem during those changes at the mill handled 200 cars per day. And when both of the plant, the nuclear power plant and the steel mill were operating, they were running 600 cars a day. That would have been Crucible back then and running at full capacity. And remember, as I recall back in the 50s and 60s, most of the steel mills and down the river in Aliquippa, J&L, those mills were running 3 shifts. You had 13,000 employees in J&L and probably 10,000 or so in the Crucible plant in Midland. And so those guys had to get back and forth. Now, this was a very important function. And the reason why it is, and that's why I had the other map to show you where Shippingport was. Here's Shippingport on the map. If the ferry was not running, they had to drive west to either East Liverpool, Ohio, or Chester, West Virginia, cross the Chester, West Virginia bridge, and then drive back to the other side. That was 22 miles trip. And that's how you had to go back. So in order to get from Shippingport to Midland without the ferry, you had to travel through 2 states before you returned to Pennsylvania. It's rather fascinating. Now, this was the fastest route, obviously, between Shippingport and Midland, and that was until 1963. The Chrismor was hit broadside in an early morning fog. There was a tugboat named the Humphrey. It was carrying empty coal barges. A lot of traffic on the Ohio because of the mills, not only in this part in Beaver County, but down the Monongahela Valley, where you had many of the great steel mills and the coke plants, so the Fricks and the Carnegies and stuff. But on October 1, 1963, there was a huge crash, as one of the witnesses said in the fog. And Jack Morrow, who was on doing the boat, he was captaining the boat, said this barge came barreling through a known ferry crossing with absolutely no regard for the ferry. So it was fortunately 11 empty barges, 11 empty coal barges, and the ferry, unfortunately, was filled to capacity. They had 8 cars, 13 pedestrians. The ferry didn't sink, though, but 2 passengers panicked and jumped overboard. Both of them drowned. Another passenger, while the barge was up on top, but climbed into the barge and fell down in. If you've ever been near empty barges on rivers, and I had the fortunate or unfortunate, if you will, opportunity to deliver things to barges on the rivers, if there's nothing in them, they're very, very deep. And if you're not careful, you can get very, very hurt. At any rate, the barge captain said he admitted that there was a blip on the radar, but he didn't make any contact. And Bob Christy, as I said, who was piloting it that morning, he reversed his engines and he was dragged 300 yards up the river. It was the only accident in the history of the ferry, October 1963. The ferry halted operations after the accident. This is a thing, it's the best I could get. I was on the phone with a man from the Beaver County Times who owns this picture. I have permission, and I thank the Times and the Beaver Valley Historical Society for their allowing me to use photographs and getting into their archives. But I couldn't get a solid picture. This is one from the newspaper. And as you can see, the barge came up and over, crashed, and just dragged everything down, crunching everything. Now, normally people were allowed to be in the cars, but in this particular instance, no one was in the cars. They were either standing on the side and either went overboard or ran off or were in the wheelhouse, because you were allowed in the winter times, especially if it were cold, to go into the wheelhouse and the Chrismor, and then you would be able to stay warm. The ferry halted operations after this, and after a series of lawsuits, the Shippingport Ferry Company was cleared of all liability. The business was essentially dismantled due to not as much to the accident, but more to the completion of the Shippingport Bridge. It was 400 feet downstream, and a new bridge, as I showed the picture before, reduced a nostalgic 10-minute ferry ride to about a 15-second autocrossing. And the Chrismor was repaired, operated for a time out of a port near Ravenswood, West Virginia, before being removed from service. I think about a year down, maybe 2 years afterwards, it operated, but then there were not much call for ferries as they were doing interstates. If you were to go up on this map a little bit a little bit east, there's an interstate bridge, the Vanport Bridge up there, that also used to have a ferry before, and that ferry stopped because the bridge was there. So the token here, this is what it's about, the token. And this is why I got interested in it. As I said, I was at a small coin dealer in Rochester, and I saw a token for the Shippingport Ferry, and I had to have it, so I bought it, and then discovered, oh, that's down the road, and I have a chance to do all of this, so I'd like to find out more about it. And this is one of the three tokens that Mrs. Montgomery gave me when I interviewed her. She had some tokens left, not much remnants of the ferry company, but she did have some tokens, and I was fortunate enough to get them. The token here is the one that was used by the ferry. It was struck in 1952 by an unknown company in Eastern Ohio, and it was used almost for the entire last decade of the operation of the ferry. Ms. Montgomery couldn't find any paperwork to indicate which one of the companies that made tokens would do it, but she said she remembered it was Eastern Ohio. That's probably something good for someone who knows tokens a lot better than I. I'm not a token collector per se. I love history. I collect historical world coins, specifically siege coins, Hungarian dinars, in the 15 and 1600s. So those of you out there that know tokens better than me, and there's a myriad of you, maybe that's something that you could find out, or maybe I'll keep looking. So we'll see who can figure it out first. At any rate, Jack Morrow and Martha Montgomery indicated no other ticket or no other type of token was produced for the use of the ferry. This ferry, the token was exclusively used for passenger cars. 23 millimeter aluminum, blank reverse, the inscription Shippingport Ferry Company, around one round trip, same day, and the Atwood attribution is PA 860. Now, Mr. Morrow said he used to have brass washers, and at one time I had one and I lost it, and I wish I could find it. If you find a washer with SFCO in some of your Maverick token piles, he used those to keep track of his passengers. They hung on a nail. He pounded nails in a wooden board, and on a return trip, he would check the board, and if a nail had no washer on it, the ferry would wait to avoid leaving the passenger behind. So while this was an important way of getting back and forth across the river, it certainly was more a humane way of doing it as opposed to very, very deep schedules. As I said, you wanted the ferry. If it was sitting there, you waved your hand, you drove on, he took you across. You didn't have to wait 5-10 minutes or every half hour for it to fill up. He just took you across the river. Since the early 1500s, this round trip cost of the ferry was 35 cents a vehicle, containing 2 passengers, 5 cents for extra ones. If you see on here, autos, 35 cents, extra passenger, 5 cents each. Trucks were 35 cents and up, but you had to pay that by cash. Now, they were charged almost as much as $2 a time. The latter charge went to the large tractor trailers that took up more space, of course. Now, as I said earlier, Midland students used to go across the river and use the ferry to go to school. So the Midland students who lived on the other side of the river to go to Midland, they had the option to stand on the deck or ride in the cabin in the Chrismor or the Nancy, whichever one they got on. And their fares were paid by the school district, so it didn't cost them. Today, you would, if they had to do that, you would pay for buses to go across and pick them up. I know, having been as a retired school superintendent, that in the city of Pittsburgh, sometimes it's less economically feasible to hire a bus or a private vehicle to pick up a student, but rather to give them a Port Authority pass to use as they need, and sometimes even taxi passes. So that's what the school district did back then. When I shared that this Atwood valued the token at 50 cents each at the time of our interview, which was probably, well, if this was written in 91, so this was 35 years ago, when I spoke to him, it was valued at 50 cents. I don't know what it would be valued now because I haven't followed it. He said, boy, I'd be a rich man today if I could have gotten 50 cents a ride instead of 35 cents. I thought it was rather fascinating that he would comment on that. But I have to thank them because Martha Montgomery and Jack Morrow were very, very amenable to me to have me come in and sit and talk and tell me a little bit about the ferry. Now, if we went back to the first slide, which I won't go back to, I don't know if you, the marker, in an effort to compress the information about the ferry, has some things incorrect. For example, they say that it was started in 1859 and it started in 1858, and it said it was purchased by the Morrows in 1918, but it was purchased by the Flemings in 18, and the Morrows then purchased it a little bit later. And so those things have to be corrected. But the ferry was there, and it's rather interesting. And for the interest, the ferry would have looked like that, and this is the Shippingport Bridge as it looks now. And if you look down on this, you can see that this would be about from the spot where the ferry was on the Shippingport side, looking towards Ohio. And that's what the Shippingport Bridge looks like today. It was never a toll bridge. It was just a bridge to be used. This is the town of Shippingport. This is the Green Valley Methodist Church, which is in the town that sits between the Bruce Mansfield coal-fired plant, okay, looking north or east, northeast, and from there looking southwest, and these are the two stacks for the Shippingport nuclear power plant, and the town sits in between. And this is the little park, and the ferry would have run somewhere down here. This would be Shippingport Ferry Lane that came down there. Now, interestingly enough, because the bridge was there, in order to go across the bridge, you drive right past the cooling towers. And when I lived in Beaver County a number of years ago, 20 or so years ago, and people would visit, they'd want to see the power plant, and I'd take them on what I would call the nuclear tour. And we would drive to Shippingport, and you can drive right past the cooling towers and the power plant and the reactor that close at that time. And it was quite an impressive sight as the cooling towers were showering water down at the bottom before it got into the river. Rather interesting thing, but the ferry is a rather decent story. I think in the long term, it's a story of what has to happen in terms of progress. It's unfortunate that the ferry had to go after a serious accident, but essentially that's what the thing that stopped it was this road, and then the bridge that's on the other side of this road, which would be here, and that's what did it. And that's really the story of the ferry token and the Shippingport Ferry. And I would entertain any questions if you have some.
My video doesn't want to, okay, there we go. Everyone, if you would have any questions, please put them in the chat in the Q&A, and I will read them to Larry. It's a wonderful presentation, very educational. My little sister is here listening too, and she was like, they had to row home. And I was like, yeah, gotta get home somehow.
Yep, times are different. And they appreciate it because you could save 35 cents.
Yeah, Yeah.
It's not unlike when I was a kid. We would take the bus from where I lived in Allegheny County, which is about 20 miles from the city of Pittsburgh, because they had the planetarium. This was in the 50s when I was a kid, and you were able to go to the planetarium and take science courses. And so you
Wow.
would take the bus, and the bus would be 25 cents, and you'd go down, and then on the way back, if I walked 20 blocks to where the 5 and 10 was, I could buy a 10-cent bag of popcorn and the 15-cent fare. So you did whatever you could to save that few bucks if you could buy something to eat or do. And
Yeah.
with the ferry. It's the same with the ferry. And I talked to men, say, I worked in a school district next to it, and we had Midland students in our school district for a period of time. And I know, and my fellow administrator had grown up in Midland, Pennsylvania, and was part of all of this. And he did a lot of that back and forth in the river and knew a lot of the kids from the other side.
Yeah. My grandma used to say, uphill both ways in the snow.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And she didn't say anything about having to canoe, though, so she didn't have it quite as bad as she led us to believe. All right. Well, I'll give it another minute or so if you guys have any questions to put them down in the chat or the Q&A for me to read to Larry. And if there aren't any, we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah, we could wrap it up because you do have another presentation coming on after this, and it would be a good chance for them to get set up.
They can wait though. They'll be fine. It doesn't start till 5. So if you guys have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
I will say one thing, and here we're talking about all of this. Let me see if I can go back to the beginning. Okay. When I showed this map where Shippingport is, where the 2 power plants are, and the steel mill, then you had J&L, which at one time was the 2nd largest steel mill in the world here in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. And right now they're building a multi-billion-dollar cracker plant for all the shale oil that they're taking out of West Virginia and southwestern Pennsylvania. So everything around here has become more industrial, and it's rather interesting. And I used to live right down here, just over the other line where I had years ago, 20 or so years ago. And so this area was very well known to me. But when we talk about the mills and about how people survived back then, that's still going on here in Western Pennsylvania. And although we don't have steel mills per se, we have other things here in the Western Pennsylvania area that maybe the best thing that ever happened to Pittsburgh, and I don't mean to blaspheme, was a demise of the steel industry in the 70s, because we transferred into technology and medicine. So this whole area is like that. And we still have the vestiges of that. And they're talking about at some point getting rid of the Shippingport plant because it's not as effective. So, nuclear power is not in favor at this particular point.
Yeah. That's I've heard it's not the best. Well, I guess there's no question, so I will go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, Larry, very much for,
you're welcome. Thank you.
As usual, a wonderful presentation. And we'd like to thank again our ANA partner, eLearning partner, Gray Sheet, for their support of the eLearning Academy and making it possible for us to have these free webinars. So we hope you join us again for more. We have all week, every day at 5 p.m. a National Coin Week webinar. So we hope you join us for those. And I hope you all have a great night. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. See you, Logan.